People think the hardest part of standing a post is the standing. It isn't. The standing is nothing. A man can teach his legs to forget they belong to him. He can find a place behind his own eyes and live there for 2 hours at a stretch, breathing slow, letting the heat and the noise and the cameras wash past like water around a stone. No, the hardest part of standing a post is the not doing. It is keeping your hands where they are when every cord in your body has been trained, over years, to send them somewhere else. I know that better than most men who have ever worn this tunic. I will tell you why before I am finished. But you should understand it from the start, because without it the rest is just a story about a loud man getting what he had coming, and there are 1,000 of those and they are all the same. This one is different, and the difference lives in my hands. It was the 3rd week of a hot summer, the kind that turns the cobbles of the King's Quadrangle into a griddle by noon and sends the heat straight up through the soles of your boots. The bearskin sits heavy any day. On a day like that it is a furnace you carry on your head, and the wool tunic drinks the sweat and gives none of it back. We do not talk about it. We do not shift our weight to find the cooler stone. We stand and we sweat, and we let the part of us that complains go quiet and small until it gives up complaining altogether. Halford Palace is not the grandest of the royal houses of Renhold, but the King's Quadrangle is its proudest face. A great square of pale stone, gilded iron railings down the long sides, the carriage arch at the north end and the state apartments rising behind it, every window catching the sun like a row of mirrors. The public can come in past the outer screen on certain days, into a roped lane along the railings, and they do in their thousands, with their phones and their children and their hats, to watch us change the guard and to stand a few feet from a man who will not look at them, no matter what they do. That afternoon the quadrangle was not its usual self. The house had given over the lower court to the Veterans Relief Fund for an afternoon exhibition, a charity day, the kind the palace lends its name to once or twice a season. There were marquees along the west wall, white canvas snapping in the little wind. There was a raised dais near the center with a banner above it, and a roped square that, I understood, was meant to stand in for a boxing ring, because the headline of the whole affair was a famous fighter come to spar a few light rounds with some of the lads from the regimental club, shake some hands, and let the cameras turn his presence into money for men who had given their bodies to the country and gotten little enough back. That part of it I had no quarrel with. I will say that plainly. The cause was a good one, and the men it was for are men I count my own. If the price of filling that fund was an afternoon of noise and television lights in the quadrangle I had stood 100 quiet mornings in, then it was a price worth paying, and I would have paid it gladly and said nothing, and remembered none of it. His name, the fighter's, was Dane Mercer. They called him the Hammer, and the billing was not modest about it. He had never lost, 40-some bouts and not a mark in the loss column, and he wore that record the way some men wear a title they were born to and never had to earn, as a thing the world owed him deference for. I knew the name the way you know any name that is shouted often enough from enough screens. I did not follow the fight game any longer. I had my reasons for that too. He arrived past 2 o'clock, an hour late, which I came to understand was his habit and considered a kind of style. You heard him before you saw him. There was a swell in the crowd noise, a turning of heads toward the carriage arch, and then a knot of people came through it. The man at the center of it, shorter than the cameras make such men look, but broad, moving with that loose roll through the shoulders that a certain kind of fighter never loses, surrounded by handlers in dark glasses, and a young woman with a clipboard and 2 men carrying cameras walking backward in front of him, so as never to lose his face. He was handsome in the way that photographs well and tires the eye up close. He had a grin he used like a tool, and he was loud, not in volume only, though there was that, but in the way he filled a space, talking over the woman with the clipboard, calling out to faces in the crowd he could not possibly have known, throwing little combinations at the air to make the children laugh. The crowd loved it. That is not a criticism of the crowd. People have come to be entertained, And here was a man who knew how to entertain them. And for a while that is all it was, and it was harmless. My post that day was on the inner line, at the foot of the steps that led up under the carriage arch toward the state apartments, the cordon between the public part of the quadrangle and the private one. I stood at ease, rifle grounded, eyes forward, doing what I am there to do, which is to be a fixed point. A reminder that there is a line, and that the line holds whether anyone is looking at it or not. My relief was due in something under an hour. I expected to give the whole afternoon to the heat and the noise and not a thought, and to go off and have my tea and forget it. I noticed when Mercer noticed me. You learn to read a crowd from inside the stillness, not by looking, you understand, because you do not move your eyes but by feel, the way you feel a draft before you find the open window. There is a particular quality to attention when it turns toward you and decides you are interesting. I felt it gather around him as he worked the dais, shook the hands he had come to shake, took the photographs. And then I felt it turn and slide along the cobbles toward the steps, toward me, and I knew before he had taken a step that he had found his next bit of business, and that I was it. The statue. I have been called that more times than I could count and worse, and it does not touch me, but I want you to understand the look on a certain kind of man's face when he first sees one of us up close and grasps the rule we live by, that we will not react. You can watch the idea arrive behind his eyes like a gift. He can't do anything. Whatever I do, he can't do anything back. For most people that knowledge produces respect, or at least a kind of awed restraint of their own. They keep a polite distance. They take their photograph and move on. For a small number of people it produces the opposite, and Dane Mercer was, that afternoon, the purest example of the second kind I have ever stood in front of. He came over with 3 of them in tow, a handler, the woman with the clipboard, and one of the camera men, who had already lifted the camera to his eye. Mercer planted himself a careful foot and a half from me, just outside the rope, turned half toward the lens so it would have both our faces, and began. "Look at this," he said to the camera, to the crowd, to everyone but me. "Look at this fella. Don't move, do you, son? Not a muscle. They told me about you lot." He leaned in a little, studying my face the way you'd study a horse you were thinking of buying and meant to talk down the price of. "What's the secret, then? You deaf? You can't hear me, can you? Not if you can hear me." I looked at the gilt finial on the railing across the quadrangle, where I had been looking, and I kept looking at it. And I let his voice be a part of the afternoon, no different from the canvas snapping, or the children laughing, or the pigeons up under the arch. This pleased him enormously. A man who will not be reached is, to a man like that, the most exciting thing in the world, because it is a door he is certain he can get through if he just knocks hard enough. He played to the crowd. He did a little impression of my face, jaw set, eyes front, drew a laugh. He waved a hand slowly in front of my eyes, not touching them, not yet, and announced that there was nobody home. He told the camera I was a waxwork they wheeled out for the tourists. He was, I will grant him, fairly funny about it, in the cheap way that does not cost the man saying it anything. And I gave him nothing, which is the only thing I am there to give such a man, and the only thing that has ever worked. Here is the part I have never been able to make people understand who have not done it. When you stand a post under that kind of attention, you are not absent. People imagine you have gone somewhere, that the stillness is a kind of sleep. It is the opposite. You are more present than you have ever been. You see everything. I could have told you at any second of that afternoon where every one of Mercer's handlers stood, where the nearest of our own men was posted. How many phones were lifted along the rope, the exact distance from his lead foot to mine. I saw the sweat starting at his hairline under the lights. I saw the way he carried his weight, slightly forward on the balls of his feet, the habit of a man who has spent 20 years ready to throw or take a punch and cannot stand any other way. I saw all of it, and I filed all of it, the way I once filed everything about a man I was going to be in a ring with in 3 weeks' time. Because that is the thing he did not know, standing there making sport of the statue. He thought he was looking at a man who had never thrown a punch in his life. He was looking at a man who, long before he ever put on this tunic, had thrown a great many of them, for money, in front of crowds, and had been better at it than almost anyone he was ever matched against. I will tell it now, the part I owe you, because the rest does not weigh right without it. Before the regiment, before any of this, I came up in a quarry town where there were two ways for a strong boy to make a name, and the other one was down a hole in the ground. I took to the boxing the way some men take to drink, not because it was good for me but because it answered something. I was quick. I do not say that to boast. Quickness is a thing you are given, like height, and it is no more to your credit than the color of your eyes. But I had it, and I had a heavy right hand to go behind it, and a coach, an old broken-handed man named Joe Aubrey, who saw the quickness and the right hand and decided to make something of them. I won the regional titles as a boy. I went into the Army at 18 and I won there too, the Garrison Cup, and then the All-Regiment title 2 years running, which in those days meant something, meant you were the best pair of hands in a service full of hard men who fought for the pride of their cap badge. They put my name on a board in the gymnasium at Ferncross Barracks. It is probably still there. I was, for a stretch of about 3 years, as good a fighter as that whole army produced, and I knew it, and I will not pretend the knowing did not go to my head, because it did, the way it had gone to Dane Mercer's, the way it goes to all of us who are handed a thing and mistake it for a virtue. And then there was a night in a hall outside Ferncross, against a man I will not name because the naming does not matter and the man does not deserve to have that night follow his name about. He was good, not as quick as me. I caught him in the third with the right hand, the one Joe had built, square on the point of the chin, and I felt it go all the way up my arm, that sweetness that a fighter chases, and that is, I have come to think, very close to the worst thing in a man. He went down and he did not get up, and he did not get up for a long time, and when he did get up he was not, for a good while, the man he had been before I hit him. He recovered. I want to be clear about that, he came back in time to most of himself. But I sat in a corridor outside that hall in the hours when nobody yet knew if he would, with my hands still wrapped, and I looked at them, those two wrapped fists in my lap, and something in me that had been very loud for 3 years went absolutely silent, and it has stayed silent mostly ever since. I never fought again. Joe Aubrey thought I was mad. He had a champion on his hands, a man who could have gone a long way, and I walked out of his gym and I did not go back. I could not make him understand it, and I have stopped trying to make anyone understand it, but I will try with you. It was not guilt exactly, though there was guilt. It was that I had learned in that corridor what my hands were actually for, what they could actually do, and I found that I could no longer bear to use them in a way that pretended it was a game. A punch is not a game. It is the most serious thing one body can say to another. I had been saying it for sport, for a board on a gymnasium wall, and I could not do it anymore. So I let it go, and after a time I came into the foot guards and I found in the standing and the discipline and the not doing, the thing I had been looking for. Here was a place where strength was measured entirely by what you held back, where the whole craft was restraint, where a man's worth was in the storm he stood through without moving. It suited me as nothing ever had. I had spent my youth learning to deliver force. I have spent my manhood learning not to. And I will tell you without shame that the second has taken more out of me than the first ever did, and given more back. Now you know what was standing inside the tunic that afternoon, while Dane Mercer waved his hand in front of my eyes and told the cameras there was nobody home. He grew bored of the easy game, which men like that always do. Bored is the wrong word. He grew hungry for more. Giving him nothing had not turned him away. It had drawn him in, the way I knew it would, because a man who feeds on reaction starves on its absence, and that starving only makes him reach harder. He stepped over the rope. That was the first real line crossed, and a small murmur went through the part of the crowd near enough to see it. The rope was nothing a charity rope, a token, but it was a line, and he stepped over it as if lines were things that applied to other people, which, in his life, they largely had been. He came in close, closer than any of the tourists ever dared. until he was a half pace off and I could smell the cologne on him and the faint sourness of a man who had been sweating under lights. And he started to box me. Not for real, not yet, but he began to throw punches pulled, snapped short, stopping an inch or two from my face, my jaw, my chest. Jab, jab, the little hook he was famous for, all of it a hand's breadth from landing, all of it for the camera which had come in close over his shoulder to catch my eyes flinching. He was good. I will say that for the rest of my life. The hands were fast and the feet were right, and the whole machine of him moved the way a thing moves when it has been doing the one thing 10,000 hours. If I had been the waxwork he thought I was, I would have flinched, because the punches came genuinely close, and a body that does not know better recoils from that. I did not flinch, and I want to tell you the truth about why, because it is not the reason you would think. It was not courage. It was not even discipline, not in that second. It was that I was reading him, and a man who is reading a fighter does not flinch, because he can see the punch before it is thrown, in the shoulder, in the hip, in the little tell of the eyes, and a punch you have already seen holds no fear. Every shot he snapped at me, I had watched leave before it left. I knew the jab was a jab and would stop short. I knew the hook was coming a beat before his weight rolled into it. I stood inside his combinations the way you stand inside a rainstorm you have checked the sky for, wet, but unsurprised. And the not flinching, which to the crowd looked like the superhuman calm of a palace statue, was to me the most ordinary thing in the world. I had stood inside 10,000 of those. But he read the not flinching as a challenge, as men like him always will, and it lit something in him that had stopped being funny. The grin was still there, but it had changed. There is a moment when a performer stops performing and starts wanting, actually wanting, the thing he has only been pretending to want, in his case, a reaction, a flinch, a crack in the stone, some proof in front of all those phones that he was the bigger man, that even this famous unbreakable figure could be made to break by Dane Mercer. He needed it now. You could see the need on him like heat. He started to touch me. That is the second line, and a graver one. A light slap on the bearskin, knocking it slightly. A flick at the chin strap. He pushed the flat of his hand against my chest, not hard, testing, and rocked me back a half inch and crowed about it to the camera. He was breathing harder now, and the patter had gone thin, and the things he said had soured from cheap jokes into something with an edge under it. He called me names a man does not put in a story he tells. He told me I was nothing without the costume. He told me he could end me. That was the word with one hand, that the statue would go down like all the rest, that the only reason I was still standing was that I was too scared to do anything else, and that this here, was the most cowardly thing he had ever seen a man do, stand there and take it. And there it was. There was the one true thing he had said all afternoon, dressed up as the cruelest, because he was right that I was taking it, and he could not have been more wrong about why. He thought I stood and took it because I could not do otherwise. The truth is the exact opposite. And it is the whole of what I have to tell you. I stood and took it because I could do otherwise, and would not. He thought he was looking at a man with no choice. He was looking at a man making, every single second, the hardest choice he knows how to make. The one he came to this uniform to be able to keep making. The choice not to send his hands where 20 years of training begged to send them. Because I will tell you what I saw standing there. I saw, with perfect clarity, the whole of it, how it would go if I let it. I saw his lead foot, planted wrong for what he kept threatening. I saw the long opening over his low left hand, the one his trainers must have despaired of and never fixed because it never cost him against men who could not punch. I saw, mapped out in front of me like a thing already done, the short right hand I could put through that opening, the one Joe Aubrey built 30 years ago, and I knew, not hoped, knew asterisk, the way you know your own name, that it would land, and that the hammer who had never lost would go down on the cobbles of the King's Quadrangle and not get up for a while, in front of those cameras, in front of those children, in front of the men from the regimental club, who had come for a good afternoon for the Veterans Fund. I knew I could do it. That knowledge sat in my right hand the whole time, warm and willing and old. And the not doing of it was the proudest work of my life, and the cameras filmed none of that, because there was nothing to film. It looked from outside like a man standing still. It was a man holding back the strongest thing he owns with both hands, for the honor of a uniform and a memory of a corridor outside Ferncross, and a vow he had made to himself with his fists still wrapped. He should have stopped there. A great deal would have been different if he had stopped there, if some last working part of his judgment had told him he had pushed a strange thing as far as it would go and ought now to take his laugh and his footage and move on. But men who have never lost do not have that working part. It atrophies. 40-some times the world had told Dane Mercer that he could keep going, that there was no bottom to what he could get away with, and the world had built him into a man who genuinely did not believe a line existed that he could not cross. So he crossed the last one. He drew back, and he threw a real punch at my head. I want to be exact about this, because the slow footage that the whole world saw later does not show it the way it was, and I am the only man who can tell you what it was, because I am the only man it happened to. It was not a tap, not a flick, not the pulled show punches he had been snapping all afternoon. He set his feet wrongly, but he set them, and he turned his hip into it, and he threw the hook he is famous for, full at the side of my jaw, with the whole of his weight and 20 years of practice behind it, in front of 100 phones, at a man he believed could not so much as duck. And here is where the years come back, whether you have made peace with them or not. A body forgets nothing it has truly learned. I did not decide to slip it. There was no time to decide anything, and that is the point. Slipping a punch is not a decision. It is a thing that lives below decisions, in the place where you have put 10,000 hours, and when the hook came I was simply, suddenly, not where it was going by perhaps 3 inches, a small drop and turn of the head off the line of it that took the side of my jaw out of its path and put nothing but the hot summer air where the hammer's famous hook had been promised a target. He had thrown it so hard and so certain of hitting that the missing of it took him. A man who lands a punch is anchored by the landing. A man who misses one that big is betrayed by his own commitment, his weight carried on past where the blow should have stopped it, his balance thrown forward and down toward the cobbles. He stumbled, hard, 2 staggering steps, arms wheeling, the grin gone entirely now, replaced by the blank open look of a man whose body has done something his pride did not authorize. And for one moment Dane Mercer, the undefeated, was helpless on his feet in front of the whole world, going down toward the stone of the king's quadrangle under the weight of his own unanswered punch. And I caught him. This is the part I am asked about most, by the few I have ever told, and the part that matters most to me. I did not let him fall. It would have been so easy and so satisfying to the part of every man that wants such things, to step back and let the hammer go face down on the cobbles by himself and call it justice. I did not do that, and I did not strike him, though the short right hand was right there, ready, the opening wide as a barn door over his dropped left. His chin hung out and unprotected as it had not been in 20 years of professional fighting. I have been asked whether I was tempted. I was not. That is the truth, and I do not expect to be believed about it. But I was not tempted in the slightest, because 30 years ago in a corridor I had already had every argument with that temptation that I was ever going to have, and I won it. And a thing you have truly won once you do not have to win again. What I did was this. As he stumbled past me I stepped 1 short step, the footwork older in me than almost anything, and I put my hands on him, not in anger and not to hurt. I took his throwing arm at the wrist and the elbow, the way a man learns to take an arm when the point is to control it and not to break it, and I turned him, using his own forward weight off his feet and down, controlled onto the cobbles, and I came down with him with a knee across his shoulders and his caught arm held just so, firm, exact, the position holding him fast and giving him nothing to fight against. Hurting him not at all if he was still and only if he tried to surge up against the lock, which after 1 short test he discovered, and went still. It took perhaps 2 seconds. It made no noise. There was no blood and no broken thing and no spectacle of violence, and that, I have come to understand, is precisely why it struck people the way it did. They had been promised by his whole performance a fight. The statue cracked, the guard either humiliated or roused to brawling. What they got instead was a famous fighter throwing his hardest at a still man, missing entirely, and finding himself, an eye blink later, held quiet and unhurt and utterly helpless on the ground by a man who had not, in the whole exchange, thrown a single punch. The thing that humbled Dane Mercer was not a blow. It was the complete and visible absence of one. It was a man who could have ended him choosing, in front of everyone, not to, and ending him far more thoroughly by the choosing. Our own men were on it in seconds, the duty sergeant, Pell, and 2 of the palace police who had been near the marquees, and they did the rest properly and by the book. I gave Mercer up to them the moment they had hold of him, and I came back to my feet, and I straightened the tunic, and I picked up the rifle, which had stayed grounded the whole time and which I had never reached for, because a man does not bring a weapon to a thing his hands can settle, and I stood my post. That is the thing I want you to see most. I stood my post. The relief was not yet due, so I went back to the place behind my eyes and I put my gaze back on the gilt finial across the quadrangle, and I stood there motionless, while behind me they put the cuffs on the man who had never lost, and the cameras swung between his face and mine, his furious and red and finally, at last, reachable, and mine giving them once again precisely nothing. I do not say that to seem hard. I say it because it was the only fitting end to it. The whole afternoon had been his noise against my stillness, and the stillness had won, and the right way to finish was to return to the stillness as if the noise had never been, because to that stillness, in the end, the noise was nothing at all. They led him out under the carriage arch. He had come swaggering in through an hour before. He went loudly, of course. The men like that always do, the threats and the lawyers and the do-you-know-who-I-ams. But the loudness had a new note in it now, a cracked, panicked note, because some animal part of him had grasped, even if the rest had not yet, that something had happened that all his record and all his fame could not undo, and that it had happened to him in front of every camera that mattered, and that there was no taking it back. There was an old man in the crowd. I did not see him at the time. I learned of him afterward, the way I learned most of what happened beyond the small, still circle of my own attention. He had come with the regimental club, an old fight man. The sort who hangs about a gymnasium his whole life because he has nowhere else he would rather die. And he had stood in the crowd watching the whole performance, and when it ended, when the famous champion was faced on and held and the still guard had not thrown a punch, he had begun, quietly at first and then not quietly, to talk to the people around him. To tell them, because he, of all the hundreds there, was perhaps the one man who had recognized the slip. He knew that drop and turn of the head off the line of a hook. He had seen it before, long ago, in a hall outside Ferncross, thrown by a quick boy with a heavy right hand whose name, he was now telling everyone who would listen, was on a board in a gymnasium still, the best pair of hands the whole army had produced in 20 years, a champion who had walked away at the height of it and never told a soul why. Old Joe Aubrey. I had not known he was there. I would not have known him in the crowd if I had looked after 30 years, but he knew me, he said later, the moment I slipped that punch, knew me by the slip the way you know an old friend by his walk from across a street, and what he felt. He told me, for he found me after, and we have spoken since. And that is its own story, was not surprise but a kind of completion, as if a thing he had grieved for 30 years had finally come round to make sense. His telling of it was what turned the afternoon from a viral clip into something else. Without it, the footage was only a guard manhandling a celebrity, and the world being what it is, half of it would have decided the guard was a brute. But the old man's words ran out from the crowd into the cameras and out across the wires, and by the evening the story had its true shape. That the silent guardsman who had held still through an hour of abuse and slipped the hammer's best punch and put him on the ground without a blow had once, himself, been a champion fighter, the best in the army, A man who could have ended Dane Mercer with one hand he chose 3 times over not to throw. That changed everything. A guard who cannot fight back and endures is one kind of story. A guard who can destroy you with ease and chooses restraint instead is another kind entirely, the kind that lasts. It went the way these things go, only more so. By morning, Dane Mercer's sponsors had begun, in the careful language of people abandoning a sinking thing, to suspend and review and distance. By the second day, the review boards of his sport had opened their files, and the charges from the palace police stood plainly. An assault filmed from 40 angles with no version of it that helped him, and the record that had been his whole identity, the never lost, the untouchable, was suddenly the cruelest thing about him, because the whole world had now watched him touched and bested and humbled by a man who would not even fight him. The man who had spent his life proving he could not be beaten had been beaten, in the eyes of everyone, by a beating that never came. There is a justice in that shape so complete that I do not think any sentence a court could pass would equal it. The court did its work in time, but the real sentence was passed in the king's quadrangle in those 2 silent seconds, and there is no appealing it. For myself, there was the inquiry that always follows when a guardsman puts his hands on a member of the public, and I did not mind it, because an inquiry is only the uniform asking whether you held its honor or spent it, and I knew which I had done. The footage answered for me more clearly than I could have. There is not a frame of it in which I am the aggressor. An hour of a man's abuse, a real punch thrown at my head, a slip, a controlled restraint, no strike, the immediate handover to the proper authority, and then a return to the post. They found, as they were bound to, that I had used the least force a man could use and still keep the king's peace and his own person whole, that I had at every moment held back far more than I had let out. The colonel said a thing to me after that I will keep to myself, but I will tell you it was the only commendation in 30 years that ever made my eyes sting, because it was about the punch I did not throw, and he was a fighting man himself, and he understood, as few do, exactly what that not throwing had cost. Joe Aubrey, when we sat down together at last, a fortnight after in a quiet room with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, did not talk about the slip or the restraint or the famous man on the cobbles. He talked about the boy in the corridor at Ferncross, 30 years gone with his hands still wrapped, who would not tell him why he was walking away. "I never understood it," he said. "All these years, I thought you were throwing away the best thing you had." He looked at me a long time, an old fighter looking at an old fighter. "I understand it now," he said. "You weren't throwing it away. You were just waiting to do it properly." And we did not say anything more about it, because there was nothing more that needed saying, and we drank our cold tea, and that was the closest I have ever come to feeling that the thing in the corridor had been paid off in full. People still ask me, the few who know, whether I ever wished I had hit him. They cannot help asking. They want me to admit that somewhere in me I longed to put that short right hand through the open guard and feel it land, that the not doing was a sacrifice I made grudgingly, that the man underneath the stillness was straining at the leash the whole time and would have loved nothing more than to be let off it. And I understand the asking, because that is how most men are built, and there is no shame in being built that way. But here is the truth, and it is the last thing I have to tell you, and it is the thing the whole story is for. I did not wish I had hit him, not in the moment and not since. The wish to hit him belonged to a younger man, a quarry boy with a board on a gymnasium wall, and I buried that man in a corridor a long time ago, and I have not missed him. The man who stood that post wanted only one thing, and it was the thing he got, to hold completely against everything that came, and to put down what needed putting down without spending a single ounce of force he did not have to spend. That is not a lesser victory than the knockout. I have had the knockout. I know exactly what it is worth, and what it costs, and the price of it in a corridor at 3 in the morning. This was worth more and cost more, and I would not trade it. The hardest part of standing a post is the not doing. I told you that at the start, and you may have thought it a small thing, a matter of aching legs and patience. It is not a small thing. It is the largest thing I know. Any strong man can deliver a blow. The world is full of strong men, and most of the harm in it is theirs. It takes no greatness to be the hammer. The greatness, if there is any in this story, is in the hands that stayed where they were, that held the strongest thing they own behind a wall of wool and silence, and let a man's own arrogance carry him down to the stone, and then would not even let him fall hard. I stood the rest of my watch that afternoon, after they had taken him out, and the crowd had quieted, and the marquise came down, and the long shadows came across the quadrangle and took some of the heat out of the stone. I gave them nothing, as I always do, eyes front, the rifle grounded, the bearskin heavy on my head. And inside the tunic, where no camera can go and no crowd can reach, a man who had once been a champion stood very quiet and very glad, holding in his two unspent hands the only kind of strength he has ever truly respected, which is the strength of the blow you are entirely able to throw, and choose, for something larger than yourself to keep.